Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Farming Focus, the podcast for farmers across the Southwest, proudly brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I'm your host, Peter Green. Today we're getting practical. If you're thinking about introducing trees onto your farm, how do you know which ones are right for your land and your business? I'm joined once again by Tom Kemp from Working Woodlands, Cornwall, and Sir Harry Studholme from the Perridge Estate, who'll be sharing their thoughts on choosing the right trees to make agroforestry a success on farm, with the caveat, of course, that every farm and all the contexts are different. So I'm conscious that there's no one-size-fits-all piece of advice. Harry, you spoke in last week's main episode about the importance of looking at our context. Could you just give listeners a reminder of how important it is to take stock of that and what sort of things we should be looking at and thinking about when we're taking our context into consideration, please?
Well, trees have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to adapt to the right soils and to be different in what they are. So there are trees that like more fertile soils. There are trees that like poorer soils. Not so much they like it, but they can grow in those less fertile soils. So things like birch, which are pioneer trees, which grow almost, and ash historically, which unfortunately we can't grow anymore, was a tree that would just sow itself anywhere and grow very easily in difficult places. There are trees like alder that like to have their roots in relatively wet places, and oak likes relatively fertile sites to grow well. I mean, you're picking a tree for its context, and there are books which will talk about this and advisors that can talk about the trees that will grow well in particular spaces. And there's nothing like trying it. They'll tell you if they're in the wrong place or if they're in the right one.
Something like my 7-year-old twins in that regard. I'm sure they'll let you know pretty soon when something's not going according to their plans. So Tom, when a farmer's thinking about agroforestry, what's the first thing that they should consider when choosing tree species?
Well, that sort of site context is really key, and the big influence is really a sort of climate and soil. A farmer will likely know their soils pretty well already, but relating that soil knowledge to a tree context requires an extra bit of knowledge. Yeah, getting to grips either yourself or with an advisor or consultant on what sort of trees will thrive in your setting. But then also you want to look at the qualities of those trees that you want to make use of, whether you want sort of bent stakes or really good shelter or fruit with nuts. Obviously, each tree has a different quality, even amongst the sort of the conifers for whitewood sawn timber. They all have a different sort of qualities. So I would try and come up with a list of criteria that you want your trees to do. For me, on a lot of the estates that I work and a lot of the woodlands, a key feature is that the trees can self-replicate, whether they either grow from seed well or they coppice. You can cut them down, they spring up again. That for me is key, because once I plant a tree, I don't want to have to replant that same area. But you can come up with your own list of criteria, and that will help filter out the species that that might not work so well.
Great, thank you. And Harry, I think I've previously heard you talk about perennial woodlands and perennial forests. What we've just heard Tom talk about is that exactly that? So a sort of a self-perpetuating woodland that sort of self-seeds and can establish itself? Forgive my ignorance on that one, but is that what we're talking about there?
I think yes, I think it's talking about a number of things. So from a forestry point of view, and this is not really what I was looking on an agroforester, because I'm talking about a very long period of time. My forestry land is run on what's called a continuous cover basis. And in that continuous cover basis, what we're trying to do is to use the ability of trees to regenerate to provide the next generation of trees. So actually trees that are happy here And actually, interestingly, one would say oak, for instance. I've got massive oak regeneration from the last couple of years. Ash used to seed itself, but also Douglas fir grows quite well, reproduces itself, western red cedar. It's the ability to regenerate. But he's also talking about coppicing, and that is a traditional way of managing woods that we've done for thousands of years. And that tends to be more broadleaves, although
Right.
redwoods will do it as well. So when you cut it down, and eucalyptus will do it as well, when you cut them down, they regrow. So you can get a continuous supply of poles. Although I think that's it. We look back romantically at the past. I think there are relatively few areas where coppicing has yet proved to come in, and to, except in, with chestnut it's possible, but quite problematic in the southwest, where you probably haven't talked about are deer and squirrels. And they represent an enormous problem for anything broadleaved that you need to keep on top of your deer in a way that is really not happening at the moment across the southwest.
So that's really helpful. Thank you. So something that people need to be thinking about if they're thinking about including more trees in their farmed environment is the pest management side of it. That's what you're saying?
Fundamental, absolutely fundamental.
Okay.
And that's been, we look back at processes like the Southwest Forest, which was about 20 years ago, absolutely devastated, both by grey squirrels, but also by ash dieback.
Right. Okie dokie. So that pest management piece, really important. And would I be right in thinking that that's something that people can get advice from same sorts of bodies that we've alluded to previously? So obviously there's, I guess, the Forestry Commission, but Tom, you talked about, for example, the Land Workers Alliance and their agroforestry team. Is that fair?
The Forestry Commission, especially at the moment, have a round of deer officers who can advise on deer and squirrel management. And yeah, anyone planting significant numbers of trees really should have a good plan. You can have the creation of a deer and squirrel plan created to help guide your sort of control of them. And something like deer obviously can yield a crop as well. So it's definitely something that should be managed and should be utilized. Squirrels are more of an issue, really. They're sort of, in terms of broadleaf forestry, they're one of the largest problems that we face. There's some really robust examples of how to control those things. They require a bit of work, but yeah, it's not. It shouldn't sort of stop you planting.
So while we're talking about the management of woodlands and forests outside of specific species and context, we talked there about pest management. Something that we haven't really talked about are skills to actually manage woodland. Harry, I'm particularly interested in the people side of things generally. Where should people go? How can they find out more about what's needed to manage a woodland? We alluded in the main episode to the fact that quite often people might think of woodland as something that we leave. And actually, you talked about the need to make it a day-to-day thing. So how can people find out more about what skills are required and what skills are required?
Well, there's a range of skills, not just the observational skills and the management skills and the knowing what species and how you grow it, but also the day-to-day skills of weeding the forest, of if you're trying to grow high quality timber, you might want to be pruning trees. But also if you're taking stuff out, you need to be felling, you need to be, and that there's a sort of skill there is a skill in itself. So there is a shortage. There's a shortage of forest skills, just as there is in agriculture, particularly at the basic end of things. And in going forwards a bit, you also need potentially large machinery and contractors who will manage larger scale forests. And that is a very real challenge, and one that we need to be continuously working on.
And is this somewhere where increased collaboration can help? So sharing resource skills, whether that's practically sort of showing people how to do things, or whether it's using the skills of a specialist and making sure that they are used collectively?
I think that's definitely true. If you and it's been quite difficult creating those environments. But also, if you look at places like Scandinavia or New Zealand, there are people who do combine farm skills with forestry skills,
right,
and farm equipment with forestry equipment. So those are possibilities. We haven't gone very far down that route, but definitely that there is the possibility that some forest operations take place at different times to farm operations. And so you could potentially combine that. And that was one of the drivers behind the Southwest Forest, actually.
Okay. Trying to dovetail farming and forestry and using the different times of the year.
Yeah.
So, Tom, we talked there about a couple of things that people need to be aware of if they're thinking of including more trees in their farms. But what are some of the other common mistakes that you see on farms when people are planting trees and managing them? And how can they be avoided?
I would say the sort of most obvious mistake is to forget about management and to not manage your trees. Yeah, there is definitely a narrative that woodlands are areas that you don't have to manage and that they're best unmanaged. That there's definitely strong evidence that that's not the case. Depends on your sort of agenda, but most sort of aims can be achieved through management, especially things like biodiversity and carbon, but also that essential productivity side of it. The key mistake is not to manage, and a couple of solutions to that, as we alluded to before, farmers have already got kit, and it might not be forestry kit, but it can be used, and farmers are really adaptable at using kit inventively. And so I think, yeah, farms have got a good opportunity to, they might not have the specific skills for falling and such, but they're mechanically minded. They've got tractors. They know how to use their kit and they are adaptable. And then on the other side of that is something we haven't talked about, which is sort of enterprise stacking. So the main reason why you have trees on your farm might be for shelter and for leaf browse. But if you can sort of let out those strip of trees to someone else who can get another crop out of it, whether that's blackcurrants or blueberries, or there's a whole range of different products that people can make use of, and you can get them to manage your trees for you. That is, I think, a really interesting model that we're seeing much more being integrated into things like where agroforestry and market gardening meet, but we're not seeing that really excessively used on sort of a larger scale. But I think that's quite an interesting example. There's a good example of a company in Devon, a farm business, and one of their sons didn't want to go into farming, but they were interested in forestry, and now they manage the hedges on a firewood rotation. So the people doing the farming don't have to think about cutting their hedges at all, and there's a sort of a full-time job being created just from the hedges on the farm. That's a really interesting enterprise stacking model. A bit of a buzzword, but I think it's quite interesting.
It is, and we spoke to Tim May and Dave Oates in episode 8 of Series 4 about that very thing, about stacking enterprises. But ultimately, farmers are business people, and Harry, that's something that I think our listeners are going to be most keen to understand. Is there really a commercial opportunity here for me to integrate trees, woodland, forestry on my farm and to make sure that it's worthwhile me doing so?
I think that's one of the risks of this word agroforestry. I make a return as a productive forester. The farm is a farming enterprise. Those are understandable businesses. There are clearly businesses, as described, growing blackcurrants, or in my case, starting to grow walnuts, or growing apples. They're difficult businesses. They require specific skills. They are hard work. They don't, generalizing and saying they're agroforestry is not helpful to making a profit. On the other hand, there are things that can provide marginal benefits, which are really important to businesses, of the shade and shelter and the better management of corners if you're a livestock farmer. So there are definitely things that you can do. But to say, agroforestry, it's like a well-defined, profitable career is really misleading. And that's my discomfort with the word. I think there are things that you can do. You can become a cider maker and you can grow orchards. Maybe is that agroforestry or is that making cider? I think with the term may be a little bit of a red herring.
And actually, I think that's a really helpful thing to hear. I think to understand that there are risks with applying this blanket phrase of agroforestry and making sure that people understand that we need to be businesslike, we need to be specific, we need to be intentional and purposeful in what we're doing here. We need to understand what the enterprise is and what our goals are and how we think we're going to achieve them. That's essential. Well, with that, gents, we will leave it. But a huge thank you to my guests today, Sir Harry Studholme and Tom Kemp, for another really fascinating talk about all things farming, forestry, and dare I say, agroforestry as well. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you both. Thank you.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Farming Focus. If you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss any episodes in the series.